Welcome. I'm Deb Willis. I am happy to welcome all of you. I understand there are 450 people worldwide here. We had a wonderful program last week, and I just would like to welcome all of you to the conversation on crisis, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Ellen?
Or Cheryl, do you want to say something?
Yeah, Cheryl?
Oh. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Ellen. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to echo my sister scholars who are here today with us and to welcome you all to the conversation. I wanted to take a moment not only to acknowledge the conversation that we had last week, but to also just offer some words for us to consider. And these come from a review of the Women in Migrations collection that Dr. Willis shared with us, those of us who were contributors to this first volume, Responses in Art and History. And this is a review that I think will help us to consider the context in which we are addressing you all today. And this is just a snippet from the review, which says, this collective work allows the reader to explore a myriad of topics related to migration. At the same time, the various stories offer different perspectives on the same subject, like in a game of inverted mirrors. And I want us to reflect on that, like in a game of inverted mirrors. A chosen or imposed mobility, what is considered real and what exists in an alternative media space, how a subject constructs itself and how it is constructed by others, the decision of what to photograph or not, when a journey is intentional or imposed, the view of who leaves and who remains. So these are just some of the ideas that this review had to share about this collection, but also some of the ideas that I hope that we, in our conversations today, can consider when we are focusing especially on the topic of crisis. Ellen?
So to follow that introduction, and to give some context for this project, this series of 4 talks in June is convened by the Women in Migrations Working Group, which is an interdisciplinary project founded in June of 2017 in Florence, Italy. The following summer, we published with Open Books Publishers an edited volume of the contributions of 42 women scholars, authors, and artists. The review that Cheryl was just reading is of that volume, and a link to the book is in the chat. The working group met in 2019 in Abu Dhabi. Dr. Willis curated an important exhibition at MICA entitled Migrations in Meaning and Art early this year, and a link to that, information about that exhibition is also in the chat. We anticipated being in DC in March, in Athens in June now. Neither was possible, needless to say, but thanks to the cooperation of our community, we have adapted to Zoom. None of this would have been possible without the support of many people and organizations, including NYU DC and the Broaden Center, both represented with us today by our colleague Tom McIntyre, who we thank for all of his efforts to make this technically and otherwise succeed. And NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, represented by its leader, Dr. Lisa Coleman, who we will see in a minute, and the Ford Foundation. The goal of the working group is to examine the role that art, history, and literature have played in identifying and remembering the migratory experience of women globally, including women pressed into motion by crisis of forced migrations, internal displacements, climate change, political instability, globalization, and now the pressures of a pandemic. We are aware of substantial literature on migration in the social sciences and wonder if we broaden and expand the language of migrations to include the voices of women, can we maybe ameliorate the toxicity of the public debate? When we planned this series of 4 meetings, we were and still are in the midst of a global pandemic, living through a moment of profound disorientation and dispossession. And to that crisis, we now add an explosion of righteous anger about police and other law enforcement violence and impunity, and a societal web of interlocking injustices. As in most crises, women are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Women are unequally in low-paying, high-risk, insecure, essential employment. They are on the front lines of healthcare, food services, home care, emergency, and all other services that protect the general population. Undocumented women in these positions are ineligible for government support when their jobs disappear. And then what is happening to women already displaced by war and famine and globalized climate change? With borders across the world slamming shut, people can neither stay put nor return to the places from which they have fled. Too many are stuck in detention centers, subject to substantially higher risks of becoming ill. As I turn the proceedings over to Dr. Coleman, I recall the admonition with which she centered our conversation last week. The pandemic is not our new normal, she told us. We have responsibility as we reckon with deep injustice and crises to think beyond the moment, across the border. I quote from Arundhati Roy's essay, The Pandemic as Portal. She says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past, to imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hate, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and fight for it. Some logistical notes. We will leave time at the end of all of our presentations, hopefully the last 20 minutes for questions. We invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A link and not the chat, please. If you have a question for a particular panelist, please indicate which. As you have probably already observed, the conversation will be closed captioned and recorded. And finally, we hope that you will join us again next Wednesday, June 17th, when we examine the experience of women and migrations through memoir, and the following Wednesday on June 24th through art. And I am so pleased to bring back Dr. Lisa Coleman, one of the steadfast contributors and supporters and advisors of all that we do, who will moderate today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone today who's participating is continuing to take good care. And like I said last week, as Ellen said, this is not our new normal, and so it might be our new unusual. I want to take the time to thank all those who are working on the front lines and behind the scenes to keep us all safe. As Ellen already said, so many of those people are women and members of historically disenfranchised communities, so thank you. And as we think about where all of us who are sheltering in place, we know we could not be here without the help of so many. This particular impact, of course, has been tremendous. And right now, what I'd like to do is take a moment of silence to honor all those who have contributed and gone before us, so our ancestors, and particularly whose lives have been laid down, even in this COVID-19 pandemic, and also to honor the land upon which all of us sit or stand or whatever we're doing right now. So I'd like to take about 10 minutes of silence to honor. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Today's program, we're very excited to get to our panelists. And I think I'll just end by saying, obviously this current pandemic brings together the issues of intersectionality and compounds in terms of vulnerability for women. And so as we move into this, I'm looking forward to hearing more about how we think about crisis, interventions, and representation. So we move to our first panelist now. And thank you all for joining us.
Hello, everybody. I just want to say what a true honor it is to be a part of this conversation with all these extraordinary women. Thank you so much for inviting me. Before I begin to speak a little bit about Penn, I wanted to read something to all of you that was spoken by a young activist in Amsterdam at a Black Lives Matter protest. And in her words, I hear the voice of the future of our women coming forward. Her name is Grisha Privo. I have Dutch, Nuba, Romanian, Fulani, French, Greek blood running along Macedonian, Albanian, Jewish, and Arab great-grandparents, snow-white aunties, and dark as ebony uncles, short Italian cousins, and tall Scandinavian ones. All these colorful populations of relatives and ancestors jiggle and rattle under my skin all the time, oblivious in the way I look, behave, move in the choices I make. Today, I choose to set away my own fears. I choose to come here on the stage to stand up, to tell you to choose to fight for a world where we all stand equal together, a place where Black lives matter. Today, I also want to stand up for my mother, my beautiful Sudanese Black mother, who has been so loving to this world and has been mistaken for my nanny or the cleaning lady so many times. I'm fed up of these prejudices, needing to explain time and time over, she is my mother, my blood, the person who made me. I want a world for us, for all of us, free of prejudices, a world where everyone is treated and seen equal. So as I said, I hope that in her voice, we hear the future. I am the president of Penn International, and I am the first woman elected president in 100 years. And of course, I didn't take this lightly, and I have worked for the last 6 years to place women writers in the center of Penn. In Penn, we believe very strongly in the power of literature to create social change. And there are very strong examples in the United Kingdom, if thinking of the English language, certainly Charles Dickens's Oliver changed child labor laws. The voices of Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte helped to change laws so that women could inherit and buy property. And we don't actually remember the journalism of those times, but we do remember these books. If we think of France, Victor Hugo changed the way we saw the poor. Thanks to Les Miserables, we were able to see the poor as having their dignity. In the United States, of course, the work of Toni Morrison has had a dramatic change on the country, as well as James Baldwin. And well, the list is endless. And so in Penn, we honor this, the importance of telling stories. And of course, historically, women have been unable to tell their stories for many reasons. One of the things that I did as president of Penn was to create the Penn International Women's Manifesto, which has now been translated into so many languages, and is being used by the United Nations and UNESCO as part of the heart of their global gender campaign. And I would like to read it right now. Penn International Women's Manifesto. The first and founding principle of the Penn Charter asserts that literature knows no frontiers. These frontiers were traditionally thought of as borders between countries and people. For many women in the world, and for almost all women until relatively recently, the first and the last and perhaps the most powerful frontier was the door of the house she lived in, her parents' or her husband's home. For women to have free speech, the right to read, the right to write, they need to have the right to roam physically, socially, and intellectually. There are few social systems that do not regard with hostility a woman who walks by herself. Penn believes that violence against women in all its many forms, both within the walls of a home or in the public sphere, creates dangerous forms of censorship. Across the globe, culture, religion, and tradition are repeatedly valued above human rights and are used as arguments to encourage or defend harm against women and girls. Penn believes that the act of silencing a person is to deny their existence. It is a kind of death. Humanity is both wanting and bereft without the full and free expression of women's creativity and knowledge. So that is the Women's Manifesto that has now been translated in over 50 languages. And I see it interesting from a perspective of as a work of sorrow, more than a work of anger. Sorrow at the loss of all the stories and all the books and the knowledge and imagination. So as a writer, I have written a book called Prayers for the Stolen. It's a novel based on 7 years of research into the stealing of little girls in Mexico and trafficked. Many of these little girls don't even have birth certificates, so there's no way to even know that they existed. And I just want to share with you one anecdote from that research, because here we're talking a lot in this, in these conferences about migration and not so much about the staying still, although Ellen referred to women in detention. So one of the things in this book is that I spent a lot of time in the women's jail in Mexico City, and I was shocked to see, because the women's jail is right next to the men's jail. And after being there for a while, I realized that nobody went to visit the women in jail, that there were great long queues for blocks and blocks and blocks of family members and friends queuing up to visit the men in jail. And this just simply was not true for the women. And one of the sort of extraordinary things that I've learned is that this is true all over the world, everywhere, be it Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and countries where you think that perhaps this would be different. It isn't. So I think that's a real snapshot to the true lack of value that women have. And so I wanted to share that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. And now we shall move to our next panelist, Patricia. Patricia, you're still muted. You're muted, we can't hear you.
I haven't said anything yet. Okay, so we're good. Thank you, Doctors Willis, Finley, and Coleman, and Director Toscano for creating this space for us to gather to share our work. Today I'm going to talk about a different project from what I presented in Florence and wrote about in the book. In 2014, just trying to see how to advance. Tom, do you have any input on how to advance the screen?
Patricia, if you move your cursor, and you actually put it on the PowerPoint, there you are.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Thank you. So sorry, people. In 2014, Italian curator Ludovico Pertesi invited me to make a show for the Venice Biennale. So to coincide with the 70th anniversary of the United Nations passing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and to address what I considered a global pandemic of violence against women, the kidnapped, the trafficked, the murdered, the disappeared, girls and women, I wanted to create a shrine in their honor. Chosen by the first commissioner of African descent, Okwe and Weezer, and the head of the Diocese of Venice, Shrine for Girls debuted as an official collateral solo show at the Venice Biennale. Inside the Church of San Gallo, I focused on 3 horrific events that I just couldn't shake. Boko Haram kidnapping 276 schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria, the gang rape and lynching of 2 teenage cousins in Uttar Pradesh, India, and the lifelong incarceration at forced labor Catholic institutions known as Magdalene Laundries, predominantly in Ireland and other countries. I gathered hundreds of girls' clothes from these countries and carefully composed them on the 3 stone altars inside the church to act as relics for what I considered these young gender martyrs. The feminist gesture of placing the gender martyrs' relics on top of the place where the sacred relics used to be has gone totally unnoticed by all the press. Shrines are part of every major religion's practice, and they provide a space for contemplation and petition and rituals of grieving and remembrance. Inside this deconsecrated church, I used a light, minimalist, interventionist touch, a kind of nod to the Italian Arte Povera movement, to remind us what we all have in common is our shared humanity, flesh and bone, organs and brains, our bodies. Each sculpture was accompanied by a small photograph related to the event and positioned off to the side. This allowed each viewer to have their own individual timed narrative arc and interaction with the work. By creating an installation with the remnants of what the missing bodies would have inhabited, the materiality of the fabric reminds us of who is missing and publicly acknowledges their suffering. Honoring and commemorating their spirit, this site-specific installation is a meditation on the incalculable loss of unrealized potential and hopelessness in the face of unfathomable cruelty. And I wanted to juxtapose that against the obligation we all have as citizens of the world to combat this prejudice. This work it was my attempt to restore some semblance of dignity these women were denied in life. On the high altar, I arranged a pile of saris representing a specific event in a village, tiny village, Katra, in the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. On May 27th, 2014, 2 cousins, Pushpa and Murti, were raped, murdered, and left to hang from a mango tree. The police wanted to cut down their bodies and make it go away as soon as possible. The villagers wouldn't let them and formed a silent protest because they wanted to have everyone see what had happened to their children. It was just enough time that a few people were able to take pictures with their cell phones, and then they were circulated widely. Just like technology today has become such a vital tool in our fight for racial justice. On the left-hand altar, I arranged a pile of hijabs to represent the students kidnapped from their government secondary school in the village of Chibok in the northern state of Borno in Nigeria on April 14th, 2014, by the terrorist group Boko Haram, which sparked global outrage and inspired the hashtag #BringBackOurGirls. The Nigerian journalist Ahmad Sakida, who negotiated for the girls' release on behalf of Goodluck Jonathan's government, claimed that only 15 of the 112 still missing were alive. Some reports today in 2020 estimate that it's really more like 3 to 4. On the altar to the right was a huge pile of cotton and wool and linen aprons, symbolizing the girls in prison in the Magdalene laundries, forced labor institutions predominantly run by Catholic Sisters of Mercy in Ireland, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, and the United States. Any female, adult, or minor that jeopardized a family's moral reputation, orphans, unwanted girls, the precocious, those of low mental capacity, unwed mothers, prostitutes, were sent there by their families and or law enforcement. No specific crime was committed, no legal sentence, and no end date. Their names were taken away, they were given numbers, their heads were shaved, they were starved, deliberately uneducated, and worked doing laundry for the government, the clergy, and the wealthy from dawn till dark, and their babies were sold to wealthy, rich American families. The last laundry closed in Dublin in 1996, with women who worked there in the laundry still living there through 2008. My goal for these sculptures was to move the viewer, to get under their skin and resonate enough so that they would take some action. On the exhibition's didactic panels you would see when you were leaving the church, I gave the viewers a way to act. Information about 3 nonprofit organizations I identified related to these 3 tragedies. CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Gulabi Gang, a group of hot pink sari-wearing feminist activists in India whose main targets are the politicians and the police, and Justice for the Magdalenes, a survivors resource group in Ireland. I've pledged to donate 10% of my profits from Shrine for Girls into perpetuity. The response was resoundingly positive. Everyone cried. From the billionaire art collectors to the primary school classes Italian teachers brought with lesson plans to go from altar to altar, to international tourists, to traditional biennial professional audiences, to neighbors who used to pray there when it was a functioning church, to the local baristas. Besides the school children, my favorite response was from a group of Indian women who passed through the campo one day and read Shrine for Girls in Hindi on the signage you see in front of you on the totem. The title of the show, I put it in the 12 most frequently spoken languages in the world. They saw the saris on the high altar and they went back to their hotel room, went through their luggage, found the one black sari they were traveling with for mourning and gave it to me to add to that shrine. That is how I define success as an artist. Art communicating across geographical boundaries and language barriers. I believe empathy is at the core of all great art. Art can humanize the shock of violence and transform trauma into a shared experience. It can help carry the load. It can lighten psychic burden. Collapsing symbolism into reality, art can be a call to action and a form of healing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And now we shall move on to our next panelist, and that is Jennifer Morgan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you to the organizers and to all of you who are gathered wherever you are to listen to us ruminate on the subject of crisis and migration. I want to, and I'm sorry, I just realized I haven't shared my screen. Oh, I apologize. There we go. Is it good? Okay, thank you. So I want to ask, what constitutes a crisis? If you are living in a state of perpetual harm, is the crisis the moment of more harm or the moment of reprieve? I ask because I'm not certain how to frame the history of enslaved women through the rubric of crisis without risking an absurdity of the obvious. Might not all aspects of life under enslavement be deemed crisis? Certainly. But might there not also be a productive tension to be found in the relationship between endemic stress or violence and particular crises? I think so. And to that end, I want to talk about the structures that might be revealed by thinking about runaway slave women through the notion of crisis and migration. We are accustomed to thinking of the Middle Passage as an originary moment, a forced migration that defines the history of Black people throughout the Atlantic world. But enslaved women and men took up the tool of migration at many points, collectively and individually, well before the Great Migration that stands as a watershed moment of African American history at the turn of the 20th century. I've come to think about runaways as instantiating moments of voluntary individual migrations, taking movement into their own hands to craft something new that stood as a bulwark against the totalizing crisis that was racial slavery. In our opening panel last week, Anna Arbinden-Kesson talked about artwork as a form of witness. And most of the artists and scholars who are gathered for these Women and Migrations events are indeed, through visual, literary, and poetic interventions, acting as witnesses to the inequities, violences, and displacements that demand our relentless concern, particularly now. I think of my own work as a historian in the archives as both an active witness and an amplification of the ways that enslaved women in the colonial period acted as witnesses themselves. Here, this afternoon, I'm going to read a little bit of archival evidence so as to center the practices that enslaved women mobilized in order to bear witness to the interplay between racialist thinking, the extraction of their labor, and the commodification of their bodies. I'm going to be talking about runaway advertisements. Runaway ads are a peculiar piece of writing. They are descriptive sometimes. They are spaces of speculation where slave owners imagine or project the trajectory of the runaway sometimes. They are angry sometimes. They are pleading sometimes. They are a strange manner of theater in which an owner flexes their reputed power for an audience largely unknown. But the actors are the runaways themselves, and thus the runaway advertisements placed in colonial newspapers are, I would argue, evidence of women's corporeal testimony. There are details, there are details included in advertisements that offer glimpses of a woman's past. In 1753, a woman who had been renamed Nell ran away in Bergen County, New Jersey. She had diamonds in her face. In South Carolina, a woman named Sylvia ran away along with two men. They'd been gone for over a year when the advertisement was placed. Little detail about Sylvia was included, except that her teeth were filed. Both of these women's faces then carried with them evidence that they had been born on the African continent, that they had endured a profound forced migration across the Atlantic, and that they now, for reasons we can't see at this stage, risked another migration, one arguably born of a crisis that we cannot quite bring into focus, but that the ads sometimes help us to imagine. The man who professed to own Nell described the clothing she took with her, but then ends his catalog with an exasperated, quote, "other things too tedious to mention," close quote, hinting at all that she had done to try to secure her flight. His intention, though, quote, "to have her again," is clear. Her intention has a glistening clarity too, even if it's one that's harder to specify. The ads are a chimeric source with details moving in and out of focus. Sometimes we see quite clearly what has happened. Sarah, who knows that being accused of theft will lead to a world of pain, leaves before her mistress can mark Sarah's body with punishing wounds. And Silva ran after marking the body of her master with a stone. Both of these acts suggest that we might think carefully about the ways in which enslaved women bore witness to the abuses of their enslavement. There are other crises that are also clearly marked. Women who fully understand their location and take matters into their own hands to disrupt the power dynamics that present themselves so clearly. Others do as well, pushing to capture their freedom despite the well-supported efforts of slave owners and police to thwart them. 2 instances here of women who had been captured and escaped from jails suggest again a reworking of the terms of migration and crisis. For Venus, sale and a forced move from Amwell to Trenton may have been the catalyst for her efforts at escape. The details of what she had been compelled to leave behind are left unsaid, but the losses brought upon her by the sale must have been considerable. For Violet, gone for more than 7 years, her ties to family, the man named Locke, and her 3 unnamed children have deepened during the years of her migratory moves from Pennsylvania to Maryland. The crisis of death and sale, the catalyst for her escape. The children, an anchor for her and a tantalizing source of wealth for the white man who persists in making his claim to her despite her successes at eluding him. I'm always interested in the intersection between intimacy and violence, between the ownership of children on the part of slave owners and the counterclaims made by the women who mothered them. These children embodied the crisis that lays at the heart of the structural logic of slavery, the ways in which women's bodies lay at the fulcrum of hereditary racial slavery and thus contained a deeply intimate source of crisis. In this following ad, which I should, I guess, read, take a look at it. Oh, hold on. Okay, in this ad, I'm sorry. In this ad, Rachel has determined that she would not bear another, quote, remarkably fair-complected child with flaxen hair, and instead has chosen a husband who fights in the war, one whose paternity will carry a different remarkable cast. I don't know, of course, I could be wrong, but the crisis that pressed upon this woman, big with child, who has renamed herself, is the recognition that her children are not safe at Trenton Ferry and that further south they very well may be. This is the gist of the matter. Another very light-skinned child similarly signaled something unstated in the advertisement, and the unstatedness, of course, is that the slave owner is the father of these children. Here, there is a relationship between 2 women, between Savinar and Grace. Savinar, who left earlier, gone for 6 weeks, and perhaps her owner, James Dunn, anticipated her voluntary return, maybe because she had a connection to Grace. But once Grace left with her child, Dunn jumped into action, suddenly understanding that these women were likely together with his property, the very yellow Harry, all of whom together lurking beyond the reach of this white man. Was the crisis the recognition that Harry might soon have a sibling forced upon Grace? Or was the crisis that understanding that Grace and Savannah could together provide a home for Harry far safer and more secure than the one they previously occupied on his land? Finally, for now, there is Miley, who was with child when she went away. A quiet and clear articulation of what pregnancy might portend for an enslaved woman. Whether the man who placed this ad knew it consciously or not, when Miley went away with child, she testified to her own capacity to wrench the birth of that baby out of the ledger books of a slave owner and into the arms of a family. This was a crisis. This was a catalyst. This was clear evidence that another migration was needed, and thus Miley was a witness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now we shall move on to our next panelist, Tanya. Do I see you? There you are. Yes. Hello again.
Hi, everyone. So I am Tanya Selvaratnam. I am an artist, writer, and producer. I'm also a survivor of domestic violence that I witnessed as a child and that I experienced as an adult. It is a fitting segue to be speaking after Jennifer Morgan, the connection between intimacy and violence. Early next year, I have a book coming out called Assume Nothing, A Story of Intimate Violence. And recently, I wrote an essay for the New York Times about where can domestic violence victims turn during COVID-19, and I helped produce a Night of Solidarity. So I'm here to talk about the crisis of violence against women, against the backdrop of the pandemic, and especially women of color. I'm also here to talk about how to be a brown ally. With the advent of the coronavirus pandemic, domestic violence was in the news more than I had witnessed in my lifetime. The United Nations Population Fund estimated a 20% increase globally, and that every 3 months of lockdown could result in 15 million more cases of domestic abuse than normally would be expected. The most dangerous place in the world for a woman is in her own home. During my research, I spoke with Katie Ray Jones, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And she told me horror stories about how COVID-19 was being leveraged for fear, isolation, and manipulation. One caller to the hotline spoke about her husband forcing her to wash her hands repeatedly until they were raw and bleeding. Another woman talked about her husband threatening to get her deported, which you'll see on the screen here. She was waiting for her citizenship papers. Cities around the country, such as Seattle, Washington, and San Antonio, Texas, reported increases of more than 20% in domestic violence calls. Meanwhile, sales of firearms were rising at alarming rates, with about 2 million guns sold in March. And according to the New York Times, that was the second busiest month ever for gun sales, trailing only January 2013, just after President Barack Obama's reelection and the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Perpetrators of gun violence are often perpetrators of domestic violence. The context of this crisis could exacerbate the stressors and the substance abuse that contribute to domestic violence. The horror stories of domestic violence will likely become more known after the pandemic ends. Now, the profiles of both perpetrators and victims cut across demographic lines, but it would be totally myopic to ignore the fact that domestic violence disproportionately impacts women of color. As Kimberly Crenshaw has stated, the fact that victims and abusers cut across demographic lines should not be used as a rhetorical strategy to exclude or ignore the needs of poor and colored women. Now, we all know how the pandemic has amplified the deleterious impact of underlying inequities on Black and brown communities. When I saw the statistic that African Americans are 340% more likely to lose their lives to the coronavirus, my mind exploded. Now, it is no surprise that domestic violence disproportionately impacts women of color. African Americans represent about 13% of the general population, but they make up about 40% of the homeless population, and the majority of homeless women are survivors of domestic violence. African American women make up about 29% of the prison population, and the majority of incarcerated women are survivors of domestic violence. These facts are not a coincidence. Seeking help during this pandemic can be especially hard for women of color. In an article by Ashley Southall for the New York Times, Margarita Guzman, the executive director of the Violence Intervention Program, which primarily serves the Latin community, talked about a woman who wanted to leave her abusive husband, but she decided that the risk of exposing herself or her infant to the virus at a shelter was too high. Calling the police on an abuser can be especially fraught for women of color. As Kimberly Crenshaw has written, women of color are often reluctant to call the police, a hesitancy likely due to a general unwillingness among people of color to subject their private lives to the scrutiny and control of a police force that is frequently hostile. At this point, I want to segue to the next part of my presentation, how to be a brown ally in this fight to end police brutality against Black men and women. Now, Charles Blow wrote in Allies Don't Fail Us Again, we must resist efforts to simply pacify and quell, to simply stop the awful images. We must strike at the root that the entire system operates in a way that is anti-Black, that it disadvantages and even punishes Blackness, that part of your privilege is built on my oppression. He was referring to white people, but I extend that call to brown people. I'm speaking specifically from my own experience as a South Asian. I was lucky to grow up in a home where injustice against all peoples were denounced. My father came to America as a teenager from Sri Lanka, where he himself was a discriminated against minority. His favorite author was James Baldwin. He went to medical school in Nashville, where he witnessed and experienced discrimination. But when I was growing up in Long Beach, California, I was exposed to South Asian prejudice against Blacks. As a child, when I would go into the sun, family members would stop me saying that I would get dark, and I would respond, "Black is beautiful." I knew a Sri Lankan woman whose family treated her and her son like outcasts because she had her child with a Black man. Brown on Black racism is notorious. Hassan Minhaj breaks it down in the video, which I've included in the resources, which hopefully you can see in the chat. Many brown people have been enslaved and discriminated against for centuries, especially in the former colonies, and continue to be. After 9/11, we saw more sharply how brown people, Sikhs, Muslims were targeted in America. In our current moment, brown communities can play a crucial role in standing up for and with Black communities. The action items I propose apply to combating both violence against Black people and combating domestic violence. Educate, donate, elevate, activate. Now, when I say educate, I mean confronting the brown on Black racism within our own communities. When Bollywood stars pal around with Indian Prime Minister Modi, when they appear in ads for whitening beauty products, they promote racism. We have to talk about racism with our brown friends and families, listen to each other, and hopefully change minds. When I say donate, I mean give what you can to bail funds, racial justice organizations, domestic violence organizations. When I say elevate, amplify the art and voices of Black artists and thinkers. When I say activate, I think of Killer Mike's call to plot, plan, strategize, organize, mobilize. Hold elected officials accountable, call for criminal justice reform, call for stronger laws on domestic violence, get out the vote. I also think about what Hassan Minhaj said. We have to be the ones that pull the cop off George Floyd's neck. We have a lot of work to do. There are those who still dwell in pre-pandemic America, and there are those who continue to idealize pre-Civil War America. We have to fight against those forces and somehow have sympathy for them as well. They have to be unbrainwashed to understand that we are all human beings who deserve the best for our families and communities. As Michelle Alexander wrote, our only hope for our collective liberation is a politics of deep solidarity rooted in love. On that note, I'd like to end with a few images from artists and thinkers that I've been lucky to work with, as well as images that have moved me. There's Carrie Mae Weems in her powerful photo essay for the New York Times last week. I was fortunate to work with Carrie on a show called Grace Notes, which was in part a commemoration of Black lives lost since the election of President Obama. There's Anna DeVere Smith, faculty member at NYU. Her show, Notes from the Field, is out now on HBO. Please check it out. Now, here is a fun way to elevate. Selena Gomez gave over her 179 million follower Instagram account to Black thinkers, including Sarah Lewis. And this is from Sarah's Vision and Justice Project. And that takeover on Instagram is happening now. And here are images that have moved me. George Floyd's coffin being laid to rest in Power yesterday. And there is a powerful tribute by Aziz Asmar, who created this breathtaking mural in a bombed out area in Syria. And this piece by the artist Shireen Damra, who is a Palestinian Muslim immigrant based in Chicago. She said, "Art is a tool, it's not the end. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. Ultimately, the real work comes when we all come together." And I close with my favorite quote from James Baldwin. "The precise role of the artist then is to illuminate that darkness, blaze roads through that vast forest, so that we will not in all our doing lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human dwelling place. Thank you so much for listening. Who's next?
Cheryl, Cheryl, would you introduce the next panelist? I don't think Lisa's on.
Yeah.
Arielsela?
Hello, everyone. I wanted to say thank you to the organizers for setting up this space for us to have this discussion. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Arielsela Holdbrook-Smith. I am from the School of Global Public Health with a concentration in community health science and practice. And I'm in the graduate degree program. I'm also a first-generation Ghanaian American, so both of my parents immigrated from Ghana in West Africa. And I previously worked at UC San Diego and in the San Diego area doing migration studies and women's health as well. So to begin the discussion, I just wanted to refer back to the Syrian refugee crisis, which began with the civil war on March 15th, 2011. And since then, it has become one of the largest refugee and displacement crises of our time. In terms of displacement, there is displacement within the country as well as those who have refugee status. So the estimates is around 6 million people displaced within the country, and then an additional about 5.5 million as well who have refugee status. It's important to note that at least half of them are children as well, which is important because a lot of Syrian women are in positions of caring for children or in roles of managing the home. And it was also interesting to note that amongst the resources that were destroyed in Syria, that healthcare centers, hospitals, water and utilities were among those. The scope of my work, though, focuses mostly on domestic experiences of migration and refugee resettlement, specifically within San Diego. So I worked with the San Diego County Health and Human Services Department. Specifically, we were looking at tuberculosis and experiences of tuberculosis and experiences of the healthcare system amongst refugee and migrant individuals. And so the International Rescue Committee was one of the main organizations that we worked for, especially because they do specific initiatives for women and girls. But primarily they work a lot with supporting and providing resources and references for refugee communities, migrants, asylees, in resettlement, education, empowerment, health, things of that nature, and safety and empowerment as well. One of the things that we discuss in particular in global health is cultural responsivity versus competency. So you can have the competency, you can have the knowledge, but it's important to be responsive as well. And providing spaces and services that are culturally literate, but also respond to the needs of people, especially those who are experiencing crisis, such as refugees and asylees. So to that end, we created a project that focused on cultural responsivity and collecting the stories and narratives of Syrian refugees who are experiencing the crisis, and how we can use those stories and those narratives to create better structures within the healthcare system that are not only trauma informed, but culturally responsive as well, to improve the patient-provider relationship between refugees and their healthcare providers. And in particular, we conducted a focus group of 8 women, ages 22 through 46, who had been here for less than a year. We decided that it was necessary to document these stories and the voices of women specifically. So that was why we chose to host that specific focus group. So in this sense, we kind of were using qualitative research as a form of storytelling that translates into mobility towards equity, specifically in health. And we intended to uplift, amplify, and really showcase their voices for that sort of systemic change. In terms of commentary by the women, a lot of them commented on, for instance, the length of hospital gowns being least to me, or use of different terms, especially with regards to tuberculosis. Some women commented that they regarded it as an allergy in the lungs rather than using tuberculosis specifically. And then we also wanted to discuss how and with whom to discuss sensitive topics such as reproductive health, which a lot of the women chose to get into, particularly when it comes to sharing information or sharing test results, being the one to receive that information versus maybe wanting to receive that information with their husband or a spouse or another male figure. We also discussed politeness and how that might impact a verbal expression of symptoms. So there is also a greater trend in women's pain not being believed. And when you consider healthcare and the administration of care, that disbelief of women often causes them to experience things such as high rates of childbirth death amongst minority women, for instance. And then we also discussed who might have a say in their well-being, the well-being of migrant women, especially because a lot of women did comment on having husbands present or having male relatives present as well for certain meetings with physicians or with nurses. And so that was something that we considered, especially because in social systems like healthcare, sometimes additional support is needed for advocacy purposes or even for economic support even. So when we consider who has a say in these women's well-being, we consider, yes, those male figures, but we also consider the way that the social systems are structured and how that has an impact on their well-being. So those are the kind of stories that we were hearing from them, the kind of stories that we were documenting. And in particular, we also talked about the role of caretaking as a source of pride and managing the home, and what that also means. So there were not only social roles, but we have to consider health equity and the systematic disadvantaging of migrant women, women of color, and how that plays a role in their overall well-being. So while we did focus on tuberculosis in this particular focus group and this particular project, many of the lessons that we learned were applicable to the COVID-19 situation. In particular, I wanted to reference, Tanya had just mentioned so eloquently, the disproportionate burden of disease by racial and socioeconomic status along those lines. And that is something that we're definitely seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic and how people of color are disproportionately impacted, and people from low-income backgrounds as well have been disproportionately impacted, those who are also experiencing houselessness. And so it's those kinds of lessons that we are also applying in terms of who gets believed about their symptoms and the expression of symptoms. The different expression of symptoms verbally can also impact how somebody receives care if physicians and healthcare professionals are not well versed in other ways that people might express symptoms, then that could pose an issue. We also have to think about the patient and provider dynamic and those interactions, and making sure that those are trauma informed, that they are empathetic and sensitive to the needs of particular communities, and also paying attention to mental health, for instance. Mental health is one of those topics in public health where we really focus on cultural competency, because it can show up in so many different ways, particularly mental health symptomology, and the way that it's treated and regarded in different cultures varies so widely. And amongst refugee communities, we want to think about experiences of xenophobia, racial traumas, displacement trauma, trauma from domestic violence, for instance, among women, and sexism as well, and really creating structures in place so that the system itself is trauma informed, and that all of the individuals that they come across in seeking care are also trauma informed. So the emphasis is on constant work towards visibility and active response, and using those stories and those narratives to inform providers as well. So there's a lot of paying attention to particular intersectionalities that women experience, whether they are a woman and a mother, or if they are a woman and they are low income, or anything of that sort. And especially paying attention to the experiences of women of color and migrant women, and also understanding that inequity that exists within the healthcare system, but also in experiences of illness. And those experiences and stories need to be documented in order to bring about the structural changes within the social sector, in particular to create equity and better serve these women and their families. And that is the work of our qualitative research. And so those are things that we're actively working on as well in the public health sector. So that is what I wanted to share with you all. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Arielsela. It's really wonderful. Cheryl Finley will bring us together.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Arielsela. And I just want to begin by, am I here? Yeah, you can hear me, but you can't see me, but that's fine. So I just want to begin by making the statement that, and to make sure that we all understand and we're all clear that we here at Women in Migrations stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, with the movement and the protests that are going on globally. And I know that in many of the presentations that we've seen today and also last week, we have a sense of the fact that this is a movement that's not only taking place here in the United States, but it's a movement that is global. And that we are going to come out of this, at the end of this, a different and changed people and society. I'd also like to acknowledge that today is, as many of you know, hashtag shut down the academy. We want to acknowledge that we honor these actions and as we carry on our own work today. So again, I wanted to thank all of our presenters today, Jennifer Clement, Patricia Cronin, Arielsela Holdbrook-Smith, Jennifer Morgan, and Tanya Selvaratnam. And I'd like to, as I give my remarks, just remind everyone that there is a question function. If you do have a question to pose, please place your question in the question function. And we'll be looking forward to posing those questions to our panelists going forward. But I'd like to try to just maybe draw some threads together from the presentations as we consider women in migrations and crisis. And I think that we would all agree that, you know, today of all days is a really apropos time to begin by thinking about crisis. In terms of thinking through the presentations, there were a number of things that that really seemed to stand for me in terms of how I saw some of the threads of the work of the different panelists sort of speaking to one another and coming together. And there were words like documentation, narrative, storytelling, mobility, and uplift that I thought really seemed to, and action. I think action is something that that each of the speakers discussed in her presentation. That it's not just about reading a statement or making a work of art, or working on and working with and trying to alleviate a humanitarian crisis. Rather, it's about the kinds of actions, the responsible actions that we can take afterwards. So in thinking through the first presentation by Jennifer Clement, who is the president of Penn International, her Women's Manifesto, the Penn International Women's Manifesto that she read is something that is available to each of you in the program. It's being recorded, so you'll have access to that. And there are many things that that she brought to the fore in her presentation, but I think I want to begin by addressing the way in which she read from the protester, the Dutch protester. I believe her name was Gersha, and she read this post, the statement from the Dutch protester. And I think that's something that refers to, again, throughout the presentations, but also when we think about this crisis moment that we're in, that affects women and girls, that affects Black and brown people, that affects us all. That the thing that she pointed out was this disconnect with, or inability to read, to assume, to sort of place labels upon people that really do not fit them, to try to get people to conform into different kinds of molds, the Black mold, the white mold, and so on. And I think this is an issue that really relates to the complexity of who we are as human beings, and the complexity, the rich complexity of humanity. I also wanted to address the work that Patricia Cronin shared with us, and I had the great pleasure of seeing that work at the 56th Venice Biennale, and to think about this shrine that she created for girls. One of the threads that's run throughout each of the presentations today is that we're talking, yes, about women and migrations, but at one point we were all girls, and to really think about how these multiple and layered crises in which we are all witnessing the effects today, that they're also affecting young girls as well. And to think about the way that one works as an artist, to really consider how one's work can become meaningful. It wasn't just that Patricia Cronin thought of this shrine for girls, and thought of a shrine for girls that addressed three different recent atrocities that took place on three different continents globally, but rather that she was also very interested in some type of formidable action, so that this work is not one that that visitors to the Biennale and to the place where this work was cited only just had the chance to go in and see, to absorb, to understand. She mentioned the number of different people that went there, not just visitors that you might expect at an art biennial, but also, of course, school children and others, but that she asked people to really think about how they could do something to help out, and that this action was something that was really important to her, and something that also has produced results in the end. If we look at the work of Jennifer Morgan, in sharing with us those runaway slave ads, and these are ads, as she said, again, thinking about other threads that kind of go across and through the different presentations. It's documentation, but it's also language, especially when I think back to the great charge that Jennifer Clement has in heading Penn International, and how I'm just kind of going back and forth between the Jennifers just for one moment, but how she talked about this, sorrow versus anger in the work that she's doing, and how that the loss of certain narratives, that the inability for women to do their work, the inability for us to actually get the job done, or the silencing of the work that we do is something that contributes to a great loss of knowledge and a great loss of imagination. And I want to go back to thinking about, again, this powerful tool that we have, the use of language, and referring to the work of Jennifer Morgan, and that she began with posing a question for us to consider: what constitutes a crisis? And I think that's something that we should, maybe when I finish with the next two, that we should all as panelists consider what is it that constitutes a crisis. But she shared with us several different runaway slave ads, and talked about the power of language, and also talked about the agency and power of the women who chose to run away, and who successfully, it seems, were able to run away. Her presentation of these ads, that many of us who study the history of slavery and the slave trade, myself included, are the kinds of ads that are unsettling, and the way that the descriptive nature of them really does not, in a sense, seemingly enable the women who've run away to have a certain kind of agency. But I think Morgan shares with us that, in fact, that they do. I also found it really interesting too to point out the way in which that even hundreds of years ago, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 16th century, when women ran away, that they had multiple outlets and places to go. As she suggested, sometimes they're going to meet up with someone else who's already run away. That in one of the ads that she shared with us, I just noted some of the places that were listed: Perth Amboy, and this is one in the state of New Jersey, but it was reported by a Pennsylvania journal, Newcastle, Delaware, just to think about the amount of space that's actually traveled when someone is trying so desperately to get away. And I also want to acknowledge the really important work that Tanya is doing, and especially the way in which she has really looked so closely at domestic violence, and especially looking at the way in which in this moment of the initial crisis that brought us to presenting to you in this format today, that is the global pandemic, that it was noted that violence against women and girls is something that was being experienced at a higher rate. She also talked a lot about the relationship, as Jennifer Morgan did in her work, the relationship between intimacy and violence. And I want to repeat that again: intimacy and violence. I think that's something that we all have to consider as we're thinking about the layered nature of not just violence against women, but especially, as Tanya shared with us, the multiple and sort of, I felt like the statistics that you shared, Tanya, it seemed as if in a moment they were not going to stop, but the multiple astounding statistics that we have with regards to the way in which violence against women adversely affects especially Black women and brown women. If we think about domestic violence, if we think about the prison population, if we think about the homeless shelters, if we think about the way in which access is something to help, again, to trying to help people out of situations, is something that is becoming more and more difficult to attain, especially as I see we have a time of only 15 minutes left. But it's that this help that women are appealing for is especially difficult to attain during this crisis moment. In wrapping up, speaking about Tanya's presentation, she also talked about allies and the need to have allies, and also the troubling longstanding issue of brown on Black racism. She ended with the need to educate, to donate, to elevate, and to activate. And lastly, I wanted to also address Arielsela's presentation from the standpoint of public health. and to draw a through line to thinking about the role of trauma and racial violence and domestic violence and the work that she shared with us, especially with regards to Syrian refugees, and to think about how through global public health that part of what they're working through and considering is how empathy and mental health and active response to crises is something that is extremely important, especially for women and girls. So I'm going to end my wrap up there, and I guess I'd like to ask if maybe before I get to the questions, if any of the panelists had something that they would like to add. Anyone? I can go right into the questions because we do have questions here. Okay, I'll start with the question. So this is a question for Arielsela. The question is, are you monitoring abortion rates in these resettled Syrian refugee women?
So under this project, no, we were not monitoring the abortion rates, even though I feel that questions about abortion would have been within the scope of the focus group, given that we did discuss reproductive health. I think in terms of specific numbers, that was something that we might not have had access to in terms of inquiries into the quantitative numbers of direct services received. This project specifically focused on discussion of the women's experiences.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'd like to follow up with another question. This is a question for Jennifer Morgan from an anonymous attendee. Could you please talk more about the challenges of locating the voices of slave women in archives, in papers? How can historians write about subaltern populations that were silenced? Is this a challenge that you encountered in your work?
Thank you for the question. And there's another question after that, which I think I can fold in together too at the same time.
This is Hannah Ryan's question?
Yes, Hannah Ryan's question. So there's absolutely, there's always a challenge in trying to unearth the voices of enslaved women from the archives. The runaway ads are actually, there are a number of digital collections. If you just Google runaway advertisements, there's a number of digitized collections of ads, which actually makes it easier. But the ads, as you see, are they're piecemeal. They just give you these tiny glimpses. And the rest of the work of contextualizing these fragments of women's lives is what is the real challenge. And I think that that's a place that historians have worked, for a long time to try to round out the kind of sources that we have. The other question had to do with thinking about migration as a tool for women. And I think that clearly for the act of moving is the first thing that slave owners try to control in colonial slave societies. The first codes that are directed at enslaved people are designed to stop people from moving from plantation to plantation, from the city to the countryside, from place to place. And so runaways, all runaways, women and men, strike at the heart of that need of the slave owner to maintain physical control over people and to stop them from moving. So I think that there's a way we think about migration as the response to crisis and the response to trauma, but I think it's also interesting to consider those individual acts of migration as acts of liberation or an effort to obtain liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Carol, I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question for all, and just in terms of motherhood, the act of migration through motherhood. Each one of you spoke about the experience of mothering or motherhood and the experience of mothers. I am curious about dress and the way that Patty was able to create the altar. Tanya, you're talking about how people leave. And Jennifer, as you described your mother, I'm just curious about how you're able, all of you are able, and to talk about motherhood and protection as people move from one place or to another in this sense of migration. And I know we only have about 8 minutes left, so I was just curious about that. If you can talk about clothing, dress, mothering. Jennifer, you're close.
In my book, Prayers for the Stolen, I had already done about 2 years of research talking to the women of drug traffickers, trying to figure out what the story, I knew I wanted to, that the story of women was not being told in nautical literature or in journalism. And so I wanted to very much understand how the violence was affecting women. So regarding the mothering and the protection, the reason why I ended up writing the book I wrote is because I found out that what happened is that the mothers of these little girls were digging holes in the field in Guerrero, and they were hiding their little girls in the cornfields in these holes. So when they saw these SUVs coming with men looking to steal them, they would hide them in the holes. And the other thing that that the mothers do is is to make them as ugly as possible and keep them appearing to be boys as long as possible. So they would purposefully rub chile powder on their cheeks so that they would have rashes. The only girl that was safe in that community was a girl who had been born with a hair lip, and everybody knew she was safe, she wouldn't be stolen. So that is one response to your question regarding my novel.
Thank you. Patty? No.
Patty, unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Unmute. I was just thinking about the two Indian cousins, and because running water in their district where they live is kind of rare, the reason why they were vulnerable, being kidnapped, raped, murdered, and lynched, was because they needed, menstruation is really embarrassing if you don't have a lot of the feminine hygiene products. And so they needed to go out under the cover of nighttime into the field to relieve themselves and deal with their menstruation. And that was what made them vulnerable. So it wasn't actually about mothering or motherhood, but it was just that stage of female development that made them vulnerable, and them not having, in most girls and women don't have access to the hygiene products that we're used to in the United States. And that's what I can add to that. One other thing I would like to say for Dr. Finley's question, when is it a crisis? And the first thing that came to my mind is whenever your agency is compromised or taken away, that's a crisis.
Thank you. Arielsela?
Well, Tanya was about to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tanya.
No problem. So on mothers, especially at this moment during the pandemic, I'm thinking about this conversation that happened between women thinkers about why women leaders tend to be doing better right now in this pandemic, how countries that are led by women tend to be flattening the curve better than ones that are led by men, especially authoritarian men like the one we have here. And Dolores Huerta said something that really resonated with me in that conversation, which is that women, especially women who are mothers, don't want their family members to die. And it's what also makes them less likely to want to declare war. And I think that's something for us really to take away from this moment, is how to amplify and elevate women leadership, and the reasons for why that leadership might be better at a moment when we are in the midst of a health crisis, and also in the midst of an unleashing of misogyny and racism. And I think that's really something important. I'm also thinking, with regard to my specific presentation, about the crisis that mothers are facing if they're in domestic violence situations, which is that they are being forced to make the decision between putting their own safety aside in order to because their personal safety maybe seems less important than the public health crisis. And that is another, that's why I feel the horror stories are going to emerge about domestic violence after the pandemic ends. So I think those are two very important takeaways for me with regard to mothers in this moment.
Thank you, Tanya. Arielsela.
I would like to echo that and everything that has been said previously. But I also think of mothers as advocates as well, for not only themselves, but also for their children and their families. And having to be in that protector role, but also the kind of toll that that takes as an additional stressor. And what having to be a mother presents in terms of mental health and coping with not only what's going on with the pandemic, but also those concerns, those continual concerns for the livelihood of their children and that extension of concern and additional stress. And so that's also something that we have to think about in terms of the stressors of migration and how that can be compounded by also being a mother in this situation.
Can I follow up with you, Arielsela? Well, there was one thing that you mentioned in your presentation. You talked about gesture and the misreading of gesture. And I wanted to know if you might connect that to this thread that we're already discussing about mothers and the role of mothers.
Right. So gesture in terms of health behavior, you mean? Or
yes, and we've got 2 minutes, I'm being told. But you talked about gesture and the misreading of gesture in terms of the way that often the kinds of trauma is experienced by women, how women are often not recognized, that their pain is not real because of a misreading of gesture.
Right. And some of that does come down to different cultural factors and different social cues, and how being from a different culture and now presenting in American culture sometimes means that methods of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, are not always received in the same intention or in the same mindset that it was given or expressed, which is not the fault of the women, but more so reflects a lack of understanding and a lack of education, sometimes on the parts of the providers themselves. And so that is always a point of research, but also of action, is doing the work to make sure that women are not being systematically disadvantaged based off of their own cultural background.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we've got, I think we're out of time. Is that it?
So we have about, Jennifer, do you have a minute you'd like to say we have about mothers, or because it's evident in your ads that you discuss the protection.
And even if you could refer to that image that you had presented to us one of the first times that we met, you know which one I'm talking about, right?
Yeah. So the image that that Dr. Finley is talking about is one of a woman giving birth on board a slave ship, and I want to make it clear that I'm not suggesting that women who were not mothers didn't have the same sense of a desire for protection or a desire for movement, but I do think that there's something pretty profound about mothering in the context of hereditary racial slavery, when your mothering is being interrupted by the economic gains of another person. The act of refusing to stay put, the act of running when you are, quote, with child, means that you are not only engaged in an act of mothering, but you're also engaged in an act of interrupting the logic of racial capitalism, to say that this child is not an object on your balance sheet, but is my child. And I think that that's a very important and generative place to think about how these women were bearing witness to the crisis that was hereditary racial slavery.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'd like to just, on behalf of Deb Willis, Ellen Toscano, Lisa Coleman, NYU Washington, the AUC Art Collective, and all of you wonderful panelists. I just want to say thank you so much for your work, for your tenacity, and for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us today. The session is being recorded and it will be available. I'd like to just also point out that next week at 1 o'clock on the 17th of June, we'll be discussing memoir with the panelists Bryn Evans and Destiny Fillmore of Spelman College, Tiffany Gill, Gayatri Gobinath, Yolanda Rodriguez, and Ellen Toscano. So please join us again next week, Wednesday, the 17th of June at 1 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you and being with you then. Until then, take good care and be safe.
Thank you, everyone. It's fantastic. I learned a lot and I treasure you. So we hope that we can be able to publish all of these important words and images. And just, it's a difficult time and I really appreciate all of you.